Well, good evening, everybody, and a big welcome to you all to the UK Colum monthly meeting in the George Hotel in Plimpton in Plymouth. And due to a change of events today, we're delighted to have Colum Canning with us, who has flown over from Belfast, and he has a story to tell. And we think his story is particularly interesting because Colum has been a professional banker for many years. I think what we'd like to do, Colum, if you will, is give us just a little bit of your, not too much personal detail, but tell us a bit about yourself and tell us how you got into banking and the sort of jobs you've done.
Okay. Well, I started off in Bank of Ireland in 1980, from leaving school straight into banking. So I was a career banker in the true sense of the word. Worked there for 20 years. I'm married with 2 children, a boy and a girl. Live in Northern Ireland. Also worked in London and Barclays, Canary Wharf. So I worked in Bank of Ireland for 20 years, and then I was asked to join Ulster Bank, which is part of RBS and NatWest Bank, to grow the business in Northern Ireland from the network that I'd built up over the last 20 years, which was fairly significant, and certainly it put me in a good position to develop new quality business and do that for Ulster Bank. So I did that for 10 years, from 2000 till 2010 when I resigned. But as you all probably know, the crisis in sort of 2007, 2008, 2009 started a process of the banks really began to get very severe in terms of policy and attitude towards long-standing quality businesses. And I'm sure if you've read the Tomlinson report commissioned by Vince Cable, Lawrence Tomlinson was commissioned to do a report on banking, and he looked at 1,000 cases. I assisted Lawrence with that after I'd left the bank, and probably contributed about 20% of that. So, and he also came to Northern Ireland. We had the same problems as everywhere else. I was heading up a unit, which was a corporate and business banking unit. And I was being asked to sort of move location and begin to apply these policies of GRG, which is Global Restructuring Group, which was the entity RBS used to basically change their banking in terms of putting assets into it and selling those off. There was a select committee in London with Andrew Tyree that questioned 2 of the senior bankers about were they a profit centre or a cost centre, and it was really around that whole GRG. And as a result of that, the bank actually changed the name of that, and it became a different entity. But in summary, I had 30 years banking experience with 2 different banks and eventually 4 different banks. And I was probably a lone voice in terms of standing up to these policies. And I took a very long and deliberate decision to actually, stand up and say I wasn't prepared to apply these policies.
You've had just set the scene a little bit with the type of work that you've done, because banking to most people is handling money. You looked after clients. You had some very big portfolios, £1 billion or $1 billion?
Sterling, yeah.
£1 billion.
So, yeah, collectively we had a large portfolio of customers borrowing, from 2.5 million upwards. But I actually come through, it's not that I started off in that. I came through the ranks of customer service, cashier, corporate banking, and then head of a unit. So I knew the banking industry, and I was very heavily involved in the Institute of Bankers, which is, you have the same in England here as well. But that's sort of the educational entity that provides the training and education for all banks. And we have 33,000 members in Ireland, and I was vice president of that and sat on council for 10 years. So I had a broad mix of banking, and so I had worked. That's the only industry I'd ever worked in, and the type of customer I was looking after was business customer, trading businesses, property business, right across the whole spectrum. So I decided to obviously say something about these policies, and it was particularly directed at a new head in the bank in Northern Ireland that had recently taken the role, and there was a clash of thinking in terms of how to deal with customers. So I was to be moved to a different area, and my customers that I had been, commissioned to build and grow and manage from a credit perspective were to be dismantled and by somebody else.
Right.
And you don't have to think too long and hard if the person that was put in to do that to my customers now actually heads up the Vulture Fund service, which is an American vulture company that bought the assets of RBS right across the portfolio.
Right, just define a vulture company for the non-bird watchers.
Well, in terms of service, it's a company based in America that has cash funds to take advantage of the bank wanting to sell off a portfolio. So there could be 20 billion of lending but sold for 1 billion, and the focus of service, the fund would be to put pressure on those customers that they had purchased to recover all of their borrowings, but at worst a percentage higher than what they paid. So it's a very big opportunity for the Vulture Fund, and it got rid of the portfolio from the bank, But the guy that actually took over my portfolio ended up heading up that actual fund in Ireland, which gives you an idea of the mindset. But as a result of my initiative to say something about this, life became very difficult in the bank, and I was eventually forced to resign in July 2010 and leave an industry that I certainly didn't want to leave. And I had the head of the bank union actually looking after my particular case. And I had formalised a grievance with the bank, which they say is taken seriously and researched and investigated and an outcome delivered to you. None of that happened. It was simply parked, and the head of business banking that the grievance was about began to dismantle my career, and things happened through police and different matters. My family were affected, and I ended up being taken to court effectively in November 14, which was a long process, and there was various pressures put on me to make the court thing happen faster. I was quite resilient and didn't allow that, but I ended up effectively surrendering and giving up the fight in July 2014. On the basis that, after that court hearing that day, or that court delivery of an outcome, that I would begin the process of from the other side, not being attacked, to expose what happened to me and my family, and how a career that was worked at for 30 years with no blemishes, no previous track record of any wrongdoing, was just dismantled, and I basically had no credibility, because in banking your whole career is based on track record and credibility, and that was all dismantled.
Right, Colum, just to get a little bit more detail, which I'd like to know, just to understand this. You're talking about this restructuring, a global restructuring group, and this is introducing new banking policy, which is directly affecting the clients.
Yes.
So I think you said those policies were coming in and you didn't like what was happening to clients as a result. What were the policies, and what were the sort of effects of those policies on the clients that was upsetting you?
Well, the policies were that people were being placed into a hospitalization department within the bank, and you probably have all been there, but I mean, customers don't feel they have much power or control of that. And the policies that would be administered would be, the forced receivership, the liquidation of assets and the closing down of the business. And if you go back to the experienced bankers, it's, if you take people by the hand, you understand them, and you know the industry, and you apply reasonable policies, you will take these people through that difficult period. All of that was just forgotten about.
And then it's forced the other way. So businesses that were beginning to struggle go into the bank's hospital department.
Yes.
And then what effectively the policies put pressure on them, which drives them down instead of helping them through.
Yes, and eventually they're losing their assets and their livelihood and their ability to trade,
right.
Because of the harsh policies. And that's the bank's objective, is to improve their balance sheet in terms of sell off the assets and get the cash in to improve the balance sheet.
I was going to say, what came into my mind is this the same sort of policy that was used in America with a foreclosure to take land and farms? Was that pure profit greed by the banks? And this is the banks trying to save themselves because of the collapse of the financial industry at the moment.
Well, I mean, I was always mindful of the fact that, that the reason the RBS and Lloyds Bank and the Bank of Scotland were all surviving was because of taxpayers' money, and they wouldn't be here today if that rescue wasn't implemented. The same, and yet the government had a stake in all of these banks, mostly the RBS, and in Ireland, the Irish government had 99.9% and still has of AIB Group, valued at 24 billion. Today it's a fraction of that. And the ethos was that if this money is provided to the banks, that they will apply the same, generosity or forbearance to their customers.
But that's not happening.
No, and it's still not happening.
Right. So these companies, organisations are put under pressure. They're collapsed, and then in comes the vulture fund to swoop on all these assets.
Yes.
And ultimately make a big profit out of other people's misery.
Yes, and those vulture funds, I mean, they've been buying in tranches. It hasn't been all at one go. There's been 5 or 6, and it's coming to sort of an end now in terms of the sale of that. But that's been an ongoing process for the last 4 or 5 years.
Right.
And Lawrence Tomlinson had a sample of 1,000 businesses that he had, looked at and reviewed, and was, happy beyond any doubt that what the policy was doing to the companies. He's a successful businessman in his own right. He was entrepreneur in residence in Downing Street for 12 months, worked closely with Vince Cable, so he understood business, it's so. All of this came out, 3 years probably after I was objecting to it.
Right.
And I'm not saying that, it's just I was in the job and been asked to do that policy, and yet it became much more public how bad the banks were behaving.
Right.
3 years later.
No, you were very brave because you stood up at a shareholders meeting and. Accosted the chairman of RBS, and gave a very concise breakdown of what you'd seen happening in the bank. And he this is on video, which we'll try and make available. But it was obvious he was very unsettled by your questions, your address, and then he said at the end, I think, if you've got a few issues, we'll have to see if somebody can talk to you or something. It was a very gentle put down.
I went to the RBS AGM in Edinburgh in, I think it was May, and Sir Howard Davies is the new group chief executive. Now he wouldn't have heard of me, but Ross Cohen, his chief executive, has heard of me, and again, nothing happens. But I stood up and I was the first question. You're in an auditorium, and if you want to ask a question, you have to register on a BlackBerry type machine. I was obviously fairly keen, and so he called on me first because I was obviously the first in to register. And I stood up and asked, I gave him a brief summary of what happened to me, and that would he undertake in his role as Chief Executive Group Chairman, to work with the police and work with the Ombudsman to uncover and review what happened to me. Because, my career was just completely destroyed for standing up and trying to make a difference and trying to have my voice.
Protect customers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he appeared to be quite taken back by it and said that he regretted to hear what happened, and he invited me to write to him and set out the issues, and he would consider what needed to happen from there. But he also, sort of hooked on the idea that the Ombudsman was looking at this and would like to wait to see what they said.
Right.
So he was tactful in his response, but, showed a level of interest, yes.
Okay, now you'd blown the whistle and you tried to protect customers, and then you are got at by essentially your career being attacked,
Yes.
and you have to leave. Now there comes a point now when I am not fully up to speed on it, but essentially you try and, the way it seems to me is that you then tried to publicise your case, you tried to argue your case through the system as to what was going wrong in the banking industry, and at that point it started to heat up because you ultimately end up dealing with the police, you ultimately end up dealing with the police complaints group in Northern Ireland, can't remember their name. And so it's not just your career that's taken away from you. When you fight for justice, things start to accelerate and it gets nasty. Just explain what started to happen to you after you'd left the bank, and what caused the problem after you left.
Yeah, I left in July 2010. The head of the union actually told me, he suggested that I accept the deal that the bank were offering me, which was an enhanced severance package, because he said, off the record, the guy in Belfast that you have challenged is going to effectively destroy your career, and it's over, and I strongly suggest that you take this package, sign a compromise agreement, and basically leave. So I did do that. In the meantime, I had one of my larger customers who was very reliant on the bank, had purchased shares of the bank and a private company through me. He'd done this over like a 4-year period prior to 2010, and suddenly he was told by the bank that he had to sell these shares. The bank, this particular person in the bank, told him to sell the shares and the money should be paid back to the bank against approximately 10 million of borrowings. The shares were worthless at that time, and when they were purchased, they were probably worth 100,000. So it was very insignificant in terms of the overall debt. Furthermore, and very importantly, the bank didn't hold them as security, so the customer could have said, this has nothing to do with the bank, but because the bank owned them effectively and had 10 million of borrowings out to him against assets that were probably worth about 2.5 at that time, he needed the bank more than the bank needed him. And I didn't know that this was all happening in terms of, but he was instructed by the guy at the bank to make a formal complaint to the police that he didn't know that these shares had been purchased, which was totally contradictory to his company accounts that he has to sign off on, and it's a matter of public record, where he has signed that this is a true and accurate reflection of my financial affairs. That's the words used. And he has this investment detailed in the accounts. Now, he has friends in the police through the bank as well, and so there's a biasness from day one, and that's all ignored. And there's several key parts of evidence that just got ignored, and you were up against the system, and there was nothing I could do about it. And hence why I'm going to work to expose all that wrongdoing and silencing me. And if I wasn't so energetic and forthright about this, I would be somewhere very quiet and not say anything about it.
Right. Give us some examples of what the authorities did to make your life difficult, the police in particular.
Been put in that situation and having worked for 30 years, never in a police station or talking to a police person or an investigation, you're not weary or skeptical.
You treat them as honest, professional people.
Yeah. And I recall going to the first. I was invited to come and meet with them, and the gentleman who owed the 10 million to the bank was best friends with a retired inspector whose son was head of the CID unit that he went in to make the complaint. And there was, the first thing that should have happened there was, sorry, I'm conflicted, can't speak to you. I go on holidays with you, I spend time with you, my father's with you 5 times a week. He said, every function you go to, he shouldn't have been talking to him. So these things, I didn't realize that until 18 months into the process that he had actually lodged this complaint with his close friend. And he had passed it to another individual to sort of disguise that, and I didn't find this out for some time. But at that first meeting, I was called a liar, and the customer was a wealthy, respectable individual. Well, respectable, number one, this gentleman had a track record of behaviours that I can't say here, but they were covered up 10 years earlier. And a journalist actually showed me the evidence to prove that. In terms of the wealthy, if you have a negative net worth of 7.5 million, you're not wealthy. So it says a lot when you look back to say you're a liar and he's a wealthy, respectable individual. And when I asked a solicitor about this, that's tactics, in terms of calling the person a liar. That's a tactic to try and weaken your defence and your personal self-esteem, I suppose. So this process started, and everything that was put as a counter-argument was completely ignored. And I do genuinely believe that the police were coming under fairly severe pressure in terms of they had began a process that they were now locked into, and it.
You were the target.
I was the target,
right.
And I became aware of actually that this particular police officer trawling for information. In other words, they would go out in the local city that I worked in and ask if were you a customer of mine? Did you have any experience with me? That's totally against. It's a violation of your
This is
right.
looking for dirt on you.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
And 2 other customers actually were invited to a meeting with the customer who made the complaint, not knowing that when they arrived, the actual police officer was there. So that was a surprise to them. They called me and told me about this, and so I became aware of a lot of dirty tricks, and it wasn't working because they weren't getting me into court. I then got a visit from a police officer, a different police officer, looking for my son about an allegation that is very serious, and I'm not going to say what it is, but it's
completely false.
Completely false.
Yeah.
And on the same week, I had one witness that I was presenting to court to back up my story, which was he had been present at an institute of bankers where this customer was, who had mentioned the transactions that he was disputing. His father got a visit from the same police officer on the same week about the same type of allegation. And both those cases were dropped after 6 months. but it was applying very serious pressure on me through my son and my single witness's father.
Right. And did they get as basic as saying to you, we need you to shut up and go away?
Not in as many words, but every action that I was experiencing, that was exactly what the goal that they were trying to do. Things happened that just would not normally be normal practice, and it was coming from the bank and the police. Right.
This might be a difficult question for you to answer, but you were dealing with quite a big portfolio, so you're saying in your banking sphere of influence, the bank is effectively collapsing people's businesses and taking assets in order to protect their own financial position. So you saw whatever number of businesses you saw the number that you did within your field.
Yes.
If you multiply that across the whole bank, how many people are being affected by the banks deciding that they're going to simply foreclose on them?
Well, I think anybody with any size of borrowing, and probably in excess of 100,000, were feeling the pressures. And
So how many customers would it have been UBS at this stage, or will this be RBS?
RBS.
So how many customers has RBS got?
I don't know. It's
millions.
Thousands, millions,
yeah.
I mean, RBS had the biggest balance sheet in the world. And, at the AGM that I was at, my friend was sitting beside me, and he asked a question after me, but I mean, it was a very easy question in comparison, but it was he was asking Sir Howard Davies, to shrink the biggest balance sheet in the world, what impact does that have on small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and the economy generally? Because, if you're holding the biggest balance sheet in the world and that's funding trading businesses, you being so aggressive in reducing it must be having a serious impact. And he contrasted it with the Chinese market. Excuse me. And Sir Howard, he loved the question because he said, this is what we talk about when I lectured at London School of Economics. I was pleased for that decision because the guy sitting beside me his family were the founders of the Bank of Scotland 300 years ago, and he knew neither of us were dummies, and he was taking the question seriously, but RBS has had a huge impact on the economy overall.
Right, and other people that you might have gone to for help, did you speak to politicians?
Yes, I spoke to our local MP, and he actually sought a meeting with the head of business banking that was doing this to me. But he had to frame it around, you're the customer and you're not happy, and why are you doing this? He was gentle in terms of getting directly about my case. He had to use it, that customers were suffering as a result. But I forgot to say that, the guy that put me in this position was in the bank 25 years. He was forced out of the bank within 3 months of me resigning. And as was said to Brian earlier, I mean, if you knew this guy, that was his ultimate goal, to have that role of head of business banking. His predecessor was the guy that recruited me. We grew the business, and I had a brilliant relationship with him. And
so what's the inference from this, that the bank cleaned the whole messy little business up by getting rid of both of you at the end?
Well, no, I believe that the bank actually recognised the wrongdoings that he was administering, but they were never going to admit it.
Yeah.
And the point I'm making is he left voluntarily, and for someone who sought that role so keenly, and it was his ultimate goal to be head of business banking, he didn't leave it by choice.
Yeah.
And his counterpart, interestingly, who was head of credit, was no friend of mine in terms of me fighting for my customers. I had many a battle with credit department that many bankers wouldn't take on because, they didn't have the fight for the customer. And I'm not saying, I never took my banker's hat off. At the end of the day, I did what was right. If the customer warranted support, I went as hard as I could to convince the bank to do that. But that same gentleman who's head of credit went into the NAMA process in Dublin, the whole, you maybe didn't hear about it here, but he was arrested 3 months ago by the NCA, the National Crime Agency, for alleged wrongdoings. The story still has to come out.
Right. So you go through this pretty unpleasant experience.
Yes.
And you start to search for answers as to what's happening with you, and you start to meet some other people. Now, one of the people you met was Anthony Carling, who's the Northern Ireland policeman who started to take on the banks over mortgages. He ultimately attempted an arrest of a judge in the court in Northern Ireland and was given, I think, 3 months in prison or part of that
3
sentence.
months.
And how did you come across Anthony?
Well, I continue to sort of help customers where I can because of my banking experience, and there are 2 groups that I became aware of. One sort of in the Republic of Ireland, just over the border, close to where I live, who were basically challenging the banks in terms of repossessions and receiverships and the validity of their claim. And I was sent a video of Anthony to watch, which was around the repossession of his house by Santander and how he was challenging that. And he had discovered, very interestingly, that on a statement when he did a SAR report, the subject access request, that Santander had been paid twice for his mortgage. In other words, it sold it on to a hedge fund or a vulture fund, and they were still trying to recover the money from him. And he took Santander on, went to court, and as far as I understand, he won the first case. Yeah. And a year and a half later, they come back and they're prepared in a sense because they have the judicial system on their side. And he learns very quickly that he's not going to win this argument. And his view is the judge has broken rules and warrants him to attempt an arrest. And he ends up in prison himself.
Yeah. And so, how do we do this? Had you actually learnt something by looking at what those groups were doing? You've been inside the banking system. Were you aware that there was this procedure going on with mortgages? So they.
No, not.
I'm trying not to put words in your mouth because
not while I was in the bank, because I mean that sort of. You could say it's jiggery-pokery of the balance sheet. I mean, it's not something that's heading up a corporate unit that you'd be involved with. It's done in the sort of the head office financial unit, But people say if you don't understand what was happening, Anthony, watch the film The Big Short, because it's exactly what how the banks package up the mortgages and they sell them on.
Yeah. And
The Big Short, it's an interesting film from the point of view that, there's guys that saw this and knew this in advance, but nobody was listening to him. And the credit agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's were still giving the banks very high ratings. And these collateralized loans, which is like a package of mortgages, they could be good, bad, or indifferent, but they're all sold as grade A. And that film actually, the funny part of it was, but with a serious side, these guys go to Miami or something and they want to sort of test the housing market, and they knock on the door and they ask to speak to Hannibal, who was the mortgage, the borrower, and the tenant said, "You want to speak to my landlord's cat?" Right. So that's how ridiculous it got, that that you could go to a broker, get a mortgage, and there was no sort of analysis done around repayment capacity, and certainly on interest-only mortgages, there's no emphasis on the repayment vehicle that would be in place to take out that mortgage in 20 years or 10 years, whatever.
So would you say this process had come about through incompetence or design?
Greed.
That's design.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely agreed.
Right.
Yeah, because when I went to one of those groups, they explained how this process worked. I mean, the old banking style is that if you have 100,000 in deposit from various customers, you can lend $1 million, and that model just didn't become profitable enough for the banks. So they accelerated these loans, and then they packaged them up and sold them on, got the money in, and then they lent out a multiple of that again, and that's this. And
this is the Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, and that has to stop at some point. It can't go on forever.
Right. And do you think we're now getting to the point where it's about to stop because that bubble is getting too big?
Yes.
How long have we got?
Well, I think it's clearly recognised that is the issue, and I think they're trying to work their way through it in terms of diverting a disaster.
Right.
But there are banks like Deutsche Bank, that were historically a very strong institution, very vulnerable.
Yeah, now very vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what if you had your magic wand, what would you do to sort the banking industry out?
Well, I think it has to go. I mean, the whole focus has been, the banks talk about know your customer, KYC. It's the opposite. Don't know your customer, strip the assets, get funds in to improve the balance sheet. So I think that needs to be reversed. They need to get back to old style banking principles of know what the lending risk is, give somebody the power and the discretion within reason to manage that and begin to generate income and prosperity in the economy.
Right. I think if Mike Robinson was sat in my chair, he'd be saying to you, we need separation of the high-risk banks and the high street banks, because a high street bank just providing the service for people to get money and deposit money and maybe borrow some money, that's something that could be controlled. But the big problem is on the banks that are taking the high risk on all of these so-called toxic assets. So would you support a Glass-Steagall type separation between high street banks and the other banks?
Yeah, I think I would if it was structured correctly in terms of the risk and meeting the needs of day-to-day businesses. It definitely has to change. I mean, I spent some time in Germany and working in some of the banks that were owned by the county and the state. And each, like Sparkasse, had a division within each county, and the profits were, generated at a reasonable level for the reinvestment of their services. So that works.
Colum, I think I've got to the end of my questions, and I think you've given a very concise report. And I also know it takes a bit of courage to sit or stand in front of other people and talk about what's happened to you, particularly when some of that impacts on your family and your career and your reputation. So I'm going to say thank you very much for having the courage to do that. And I'm going to say if you join me in giving a round of applause for a very concise